Hello, this is Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center. I'm here today with Mandee Labelle, a personal friend, a yoga and meditation teacher here in Nova Scotia. And I'm really delighted to have the chance to talk today with Mandee. She's a teacher and a student with Francis Lucille. And I'm going to let her introduce herself in more detail and talk about what it is that you do in your practice and your teaching and what it is that we're going to talk about today in the interview.
When it comes to what I'm doing, it's something that is elicited from within. So, in a sense, you could call it there's teaching that happens and learning that happens, but really what we discover is not something taught. So, that's the beauty of what, through this path of yoga, I've come to discover. And it's something that I had an intuition about in the beginning. Maybe it's just the independence of the Western culture of wanting to find out for yourself. There's it's really beautiful because what I loved from the very beginning about yoga is that you could receive many teachings, but all the teachings were meant for you to check it out for yourself and to see what's true deep inside. That's tricky too, because sometimes we have to get past ourselves in order to find something.
Mhm.
And so that's also part of the things that you can discover in yoga, how to get past yourself in order to discover yourself. And it's been an interesting journey because it's been surprising along the way. I guess I was following my heart from the very beginning, and it led me into yoga through enthusiasm and just the joy of stretching and breathing. There's something very natural about it. We can make it really complicated, but after, I've been, offering yoga classes for 18 years, and I keep marveling at how, first of all, how it works. It really
Mhm.
works. We come in the room and we relax a little bit, and that's what I mean by it works. I mean, what more
Mhm.
do we want than
Mhm.
to just relax a
Yeah.
little bit here? We
Mhm.
think we want other things, but the question is, what do you get when you get what you want? You get a moment of like, okay, until we're on to the next thing.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of the very simple things in yoga that help to bring us to some basic relaxation. But there's so much more to yoga than that as well, which is what the discovery process is. How to get over ourselves to find ourselves. It's just a tricky way of saying it, but to be more precise, it's to get past who we think we are to discover who we truly are. You
Mhm.
know, we assume to be who we think we are. We assume to be the stories that we tell about ourselves. You and as we see that those stories, they change and they evolve and they heal and they do all kinds of things, they lighten or they become heavier, but all along you're there all along. To actually take a step back from our story with compassion and gentleness, it can lead to some really deep questions. And what I love about this discovery process is that what we discover is actually good news. Yeah, it fosters the journey. Sometimes we're in the beginning we're a little afraid to discover because we're afraid of what we might find because we feel like there might be some dark things in there. But as we take steps, often with help from our friends, help from our teachers, help from life, we start to discover that this discovery process is a there's a reason they call it enlightening, because it's lightening. It lightens the load, and we feel lighter in our lives the more we recognize who we truly are. So it fosters its own momentum and interest through that lightening process. And sometimes we encounter some things along the way that we need to work through, but it's very fruitful to be on the path.
I think it would be correct to say that a lot of people have stories that we're identified with. This is our personal experience. We've had these things happen. These are the beliefs we've formed. Can you talk a little bit about the process of seeing those and letting them go, or transforming them, or what you discover in that process?
It seems to be a real moment in time in a life when there's the recognition that it is a story. And so when somebody even says that it's a story to someone else, it can be, if if we're not there yet, it's almost belittling in a way. So there's a moment of recognition where we start to recognize our mind. But before we actually recognize our mind, if we just see that as reality, we take it to be reality. So it's a really incredible moment when we see it. It begins a new tangent, or not a tangent, but a new leg of the journey. Because I guess in Zen they call it a backward step. It's when you start to notice what you're noticing and notice that there's something that's noticing. I think in many traditions they introduce a practice called witnessing, and so when you start to witness, you start to see your thoughts, and it leads to the recognition that we're not our thoughts, we're experiencing our thoughts, and then if we get curious, and that's an important ingredient on the journey, is curiosity. Sometimes we're fueled in the beginning through suffering, but when curiosity takes over, then we're really moving on the path, because curiosity will take you places that you might not have even realized you wanted to go, just because you wanted to find out. And so when we start to see our thoughts, we might get a little curious about where they came from, and how they got put together. And perhaps if we're guided in a compassionate way, we might even see the innocence of how our mind was assembled and inherited, and it's culturally inherited and collectively inherited, like just the way we think and how we feel about ourselves. So if you even just recognize that a lot of our thoughts are inherited, it lends itself to the recognition that it can't be me if I learned it.
So sometimes people have an experience in yoga class of relaxation and stillness, and maybe a very unusual experience of stillness in the mind. That as our body softens and relaxes and we focus, that maybe that catastrophic thinking or the compulsion in the mind, the ruminating, starts to settle. And we have that experience of not much thought for a bit, an experience of more ease in our body and our breath. So when you're talking about somebody seeing that we're having the experience of thought, that we're not our thoughts, is that related to what you're talking about?
It would be related,
Hmm.
because even to have some recognition, slowing down can help. Slowing down can help with a lot of things. And so when we come into the yoga situation, and what we're talking about is hatha yoga, I love to point out that most people take asana practice to be yoga, but yoga is much huger than the physical practice. But when people come into a room that has been set up for peace and kindness, the body naturally it can sense that, and starts to align and harmonize with that, and it's very healthy. It's nice to even create our home spaces in a way that would create that kind of effect. But regardless of the life path, whether it be one of a lot of suffering, or a life path that seems to be a little lighter, we all go to sleep at night, and when we go to sleep at night, the body recognizes what it feels like to let go a little bit of the things that are on the mind. And so there's something very similar about when somebody walks into a yoga room that has that in mind, because some yoga situations are more about like physical extremes or heat or these types of things. So it wouldn't be conducive in that sense. It could be, just because you're focused on something else. But sometimes some classes, and I'm not saying that one is better than another, it's just interesting that you go into the room and your body remembers what it's like to just put it all down, that this is not the time or the place for figuring things out. And then the body can go into some kind of regulation, and the nervous system can shift from being active to more relaxed. And in that state, we're more ripe for seeing more deeply. We're not looking from the lens of problem, or so all of a sudden things open up to us in that context. There's something very beautiful about any space that's been created with peace and kindness in mind. And so that could lend to the recognition, simply because you become more available. You're less inundated with fears, and yeah, the things that drive us and drive our stress. And then a lot of insights come in a moment, by surprise, not necessarily by virtue of a long process of thinking. All of a sudden we're like, you see something. But it's because you've become available. There's more space inside. Yeah. Hard to see things when we're busy.
It is.
Mm.
One of my meditation teachers used to say, I mean, talked about the value of practicing at the same time in the same place every day, but
Mm.
talked about falling in love with your practice the
Mm.
way you would fall in love with somebody else. And you think about that person and you can hardly wait to see them. And
Yeah.
some of the patterns people bring into meditation or yoga are the same patterns of perfectionism and deficiency, and then we kind of transfer that into our practice time. Whereas if we could kind of make that shift of, wow, this is a time I get to spend with myself, to get to really know myself and to relax and soften and just really experience that, it really shifts the practice.
Absolutely. I love that you say that, Lynn, because um, I like to point out in yoga that we can entertain two things. One is sort of our ordinary way of doing things, which is like, if I do this, then that, and we live in that way most of the time. What we do, we're trying to produce some kind of result for some better tomorrow. And we almost can't help but apply that type of thinking to yoga. But we really sell ourselves short if, first of all, if that's the only reason we're doing yoga. And if we don't recognize that there's another way, which is the recognition, the discovery that's available right here and right now. So, we make these sayings, and we all kind of hear it, regardless of our backgrounds or traditions or anything, that the journey is right. It's now. The destination is here. So we intuitively sense that. But in a way, if there's something that we're practicing in yoga, is to kind of pull out of that instrumental type of thinking, because it's so common that we don't even notice it. It's almost like fish in water. We're always, and it seems like it's really good intention as well, right? But in this moment, when we go into a yoga class and we recognize and we celebrate what we are, and the mystery of the body that's working in unison and harmony, we might even be struck into a state of awe and wonder. Whereas it's not our ordinary way of looking at our body. So many, well, it's once again, it's just the way the mind works. Like if you're listening to a beautiful symphony, and then one of the musicians just sort of bumps their elbow and makes a sound, you're going to go home and, what are you going to tell everybody? Right? And so our mind is focused on things that it wants to find problem with. But when we come to rest in this moment, it the the feeling of problem can subside right in the middle of our situation, and that's a healing moment. So it's a different way of addressing our situation, but it's really valuable to be able to come to this moment right here and right now and resource inside yourself and touch something that's hard to even recognize when we're so busy, uh, you know, moving forward. It was Trungpa Rinpoche, when asked about reincarnation, he said, "Why think about that? We don't even know this." you know, like, why deal with that? Let's deal with this first. Let's come to see what's here first. And it appeals to our intelligence as well. Sometimes when we actually stop and we realize, well, okay, I feel like there's a problem, but I actually don't really know what the problem is. And we all kind of assume we know what the problem is, and then we're piling on all kinds of things. But sometimes coming to this basic rest can be very lightening and revealing, and you know brings us into ourselves, and we learn a lot just through the act of pausing. But I say that as if it's easy to stop. And that's where a lot of the technique comes in. So a lot of the things that are offered through the traditions of yoga and meditation and all the traditions are ways to really work with our condition, because it's easy to say, but here we are. As soon as we sit down, sometimes we find a stillness. Well, a lot of people sit down and all they see is the busyness. So it's different for different people at different times, but we can see we get pulled into it. About falling in love with practice, in a sense, it's an for that to happen is a type of compassion in a way, because sometimes we it's nice to say, well, I'm going to fall in love with my practice, but a lot of people don't come to it. They say, well, I should practice, or it's hard to fall in love with it. But when you start coming home to yourself and feeling the sweetness of your own being, that is a falling in love in a sense. It's not something you can do with your mind, but the invitation is helpful.
And you and I have both had the wonderful fortune of having really good teachers to work with. Can
Mm.
you speak a little bit about that process for you, working with Francis Lucille and working with the wisdom tradition, and how that kind of works and flows through you?
Yeah, because even the word teacher we could talk about that even before, um, because if you're learning something, then teaching is happening. And I've had many, many teachers, and I just feel like we're in such an incredibly uh, fortunate time, because we have so much access to so much wisdom. And there have been many teachers that have helped prepare the ground for when I met Francis. I had no idea. It wasn't like I had an idea. And I didn't even really understand, maybe for months or years, what that meeting was. you know. And I'd been interested for a long time in the healing profession. I think a lot of those that are in the healing profession is because they're trying to figure something out even inside themselves. You know, we're drawn through our own suffering and our own compassion. And I'd been searching for a long time, but not even knowing I was searching. It was more through enthusiasm. It wasn't like this desperate search. It was more like, oh, this is interesting. And wow, I'd really like to figure that out. Like very active intellectual process. And I went to university and studied psychology and couldn't get enough of it. I really wanted to understand why people did the things they did and why I did the things that I did and why we keep bumping into each other in this life, you know. And after that, I found that yoga was an even bigger playing field. It didn't just include the mind; it included the whole universe. So this deep inquiry into like, oh, why are we here, and what are we doing, and what's really going on here anyway, took on a deeper search. And I would carry books under my arm, and I just love being a student, and I love learning, and so that just never stopped. And I was lucky to find a yoga tradition that was really broad-minded, and I wasn't even looking for it. Again, I just fell into it. I was taking yoga classes, and I was loving them, and I just kept telling the teacher, "This is great. This is so amazing." And she's like, "Why don't you come for teacher training?" And I was just like, I'd never thought of it. And then when I went for teacher training, then I met David, and David was I guess, the guru of chakra yoga. And chakra yoga uh, was such a beautiful, or is such a beautiful way of looking at the universe, because in chakra yoga, you can. It's very similar to science in a way because it has a scientific side to it, and you're looking at energies and patterns and frequencies and the nature of the universe. And it's amazing, way more than asana practice, but you got to do all the asana in there too and have fun. So it was just so much fun to it. And David taught me so much about life and questioning things and really opening my mind. And I got to a point because I was like not only teaching but practicing and teaching for maybe 10 years, where in a way yoga is you're working on the instrument, and you know, you're working on the body and you're working on the mind. And I wouldn't say that it's perfect, you know, but you're, in a way, there's a kind of like an ideal in yoga that we're working towards, trying to eat well and live well and take as best care as we can. And I was like, well, is this really addressing happiness? You know, that was, I can't even say that I articulated that question at that time, but I realized that I wasn't satisfied, you know. And I just said, you know, to life, like, what, you know, what more can we do? Like, we're doing our best here. And, and I just felt this urge, and I looked through a catalog, and I saw Francis in a workshop called Eternity Now. It didn't even mention yoga, which is interesting because I probably would be more oriented towards yoga workshops. But it just said Eternity Now, which I thought were beautiful words. And I said, And then I just looked him up, and I saw him answer one question, just one question online. And I was filled with a sense of trust. I'd never felt this deep trust. And it just spurred just an enthusiasm, like, yeah, I want to go there. It was no bigger idea than that. But it was a big idea because for me at the time, I was a free-spirited yoga teacher with very little business in mind. And so I had very little, living in a tiny little shack with a wood stove, like the good yogi, you know, very little. but I pulled everything together and got in the car and drove all the way to New York for this workshop. And then the and I didn't even have big ideas at that time, and I still don't have big ideas, but my life changed, the moment I met him. My questions became deeper, but it wasn't kind of something that happened in the mind. All of a sudden, when I came home and I looked at all my books, it's like they all came to life. It's like I'd read them 10 times over, and I loved them every time, and I learned so much from them, but it was kind of like they came to life, and I don't know how best to say it. Then everything came to life. Everything came to life, and there was a profound relief. And there was a profound relief, but I can only say that now in retrospect, that had happened because it wasn't something that I saw immediately. Mhm. Yeah, and since then, I asked Francis, because when I first met him, I felt the enthusiasm of being there, and I wanted to like pursue that. And I said, what should I do? Isn't that what we ask our teachers? What should I do? And he said, follow your enthusiasm. And I thought, well, okay, I've heard that before. That's what they say. And I'm like, but I don't even know what that is sometimes. And he goes, sometimes it's just ice cream. And I just love the permission of following your heart, because if you truly find the true voice of your heart, it's taking us where we need to go, but it's hard to honor it and listen to it. And that's where the teachers come in, and that's where, you know, yoga comes in, and all of our traditions. They help us first to recognize our own wisdom and our enthusiasm, and then we foster relationships that support that, and sometimes relationships that don't support that start to fall away, and eventually, we are following our own wisdom. That's yoga. So meeting Francis, I don't even know how to describe what that is, but after that point, life changed, and I felt that my work became richer in a sense, but without a doer. Everything just got richer, but I didn't do it. It was just maybe more availability. And when availability is in the room, then we get to see our own. We get to relax into our own. So it's really a beautiful process. My enthusiasm has kept me going back to Francis as often as I can, not because of some kind of trying to get somewhere, but because that's just the best thing I can think of that I can do, with my time, because I enjoy it so much, and being with friends in the community and spending that time. But of course, something is shared, and when we meet, and that too has been a slow recognition of what it is that happens when we all get together. I was really surprised the first time I went to a retreat after having gone to New York. Maybe it happened in New York, but the next one I went to was in California, where he lives in this beautiful house that he designed specifically for people to come if they want to. It's not. It's really beautiful to go there. And when I walked in, it was strange, because I'd been in spiritual communities before, and everyone is really loving in spiritual communities. Not everyone, I'm generalizing, but at least that's what brings us there, is heartfulness. And so when you go to spiritual gatherings, you can make friends and things like that. But there was something really, um, I just felt so much love for everyone. It was like instant love, and it wasn't spiritual, it wasn't like loving. It was just like being with family, and you're happy. So it was really nice to meet the community, and that's a big part of, I think, our what we do is often in the West, sometimes we feel like we have to do things on our own, but it's nice that we have communities. There's a lot that can be said about that, especially if these communities are um, gathered, you know, as you say, in a wisdom tradition. It's very powerful.
I think one of the things that happens in those communities is that we're around people who are also more connected with their own heart and their
Mm,
own enthusiasm for life, and and maybe are a bit more trustworthy to be around, um,
mm,
than people who are more caught up in anger or, um, have are not as far along on the healing path maybe. And
yeah,
we talked a little bit about yoga as being there is a result of doing yoga and meditation of healing, and yet that's not really the purpose. We're not doing it to heal something, although that's certainly a side effect of it. Um, and so to
mhm.
have those opportunities to be in a place where that connection is really nurtured and supported is such a blessing.
It's such a blessing.
Hmm.
Yeah, we get to see so much, you know, so
Hmm.
much falls away. And I always find it funny, like if, when we're in a friendship that supports wisdom and truth, if you have something inside that comes out that you didn't even know was there, you get to see it right away. And you can laugh at yourself. Whereas if you're in the company of those who kind of partake in that, it kind of gets almost reinforced.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. So in a way, when you say something and it's not being reinforced, you get to see it.
Hmm.
It becomes part of that clarifying process as well. The things that still live in us that bubble up and all need to be released. Yeah, there's so much could be said about the community, but there's a lot to be said for the teacher.
Hmm.
Yeah.
When my meditation teacher, Swami Veda, did a 2-week retreat on emotional purification, and he'd been talking about at the end we were going to have a test, and so how is he going to test that? So he kind of did some meditation, and we were all kind of sitting there, and he says, "So I'd just like you to bring up in your mind anytime during this 2 weeks when you felt like somebody else got some recognition that you should have gotten." Or a time when you felt jealous of someone, or a time when you noticed these patterns were happening in your mind. And I mean, that was the test. It's just a reflection. Can we see what's really happening inside and how that contracts us and disconnects us from ourselves and from other people?
Yeah.
And as we let that go, then what's left is all that space for connection and love and heart opening and all of that. Just pretty amazing how that can happen.
And we make jokes about life, but at the same time, you can see how sweet it is in the sense that we don't have to do the undoing,
Mhm,
right? You don't have to do it. It doesn't mean that there's not things to be done,
mhm,
but we're not fixing anything. And in a way, I understand that there are things that get fixed,
mhm,
but ultimately what we want is a recognition. And in those with those deep questions and being able to notice,
mhm,
we begin to recognize that right here and right now. And in a sense, that's the falling in love. It's the falling away,
mhm,
because the love is here. It's not a small thing um, that when the practice starts, and practice, I use that word loosely. I just mean moments of pause,
mm, mhm.
right?
Yeah.
The real sweetness when they start to call to you. And I think that's the falling in love. It's when, on a moment where you don't have something that's so pressing, that you can just relax with a cup of tea. I think that's falling in love with your practice.
Mhm.
It's when it calls to you because there's been some settling, but um, it's not obvious, right? I understand that for many that come to the classes, we need to go slow. We need to take it step by step and take deep breaths and just realize that everybody's journey is exactly going at the speed it needs to go,
Mhm.
and that as long as we're open to, you know, some of us are not even really ready to be open. A lot of management, and that's okay too. We just make the best of our situation. But there comes a point where we stop blaming everything
Mhm.
because there's no real, well, that's it's a real turnaround at that moment. And yes, it's true, we've been affected by life and we've been affected by our childhood, and there's nothing that anybody could say about that. But there's a real moment when we feel like the solution that we're looking for is not found in a better situation, in a better mind, or in a better body.
Mhm.
It's a real moment. I remember the moment for myself exactly. I remember the exact moment, and it was Adyashanti. He just said this one thing. Great teacher. Uh,
Mhm.
he said, he said, "Where are you going?" It was, he said that he wanted to be the train wreck on your spiritual journey. And it was so outrageous to me at that time to hear that, because everything I had been doing and thinking was this almost like a train ride towards some idea.
Mhm.
Like a lot of the practices can suggest that. And he's like, I want to be your train wreck. And it was shocking. And then I did ask myself that question, where am I going?
Mhm.
And I think once again, when we hear something, it's because we already know deep inside. So we hear it. It's not like we learned it. And that's why
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
not a teaching, even though we're taught things, even though there are teachings. It's not a teaching and a learning. The reason that's important to point out is because it's already here. And then when we hear it from someone who knows, we recognize it. And that's the difference between learning and what this is. What this is a recognition. So it comes in the form of like, ah, yes, that really speaks to me. And
Mhm.
when we have that experience, you have to ask yourself, how did you know? Because I already knew somewhere deep inside, you know? And so when he said, where are you going? Something inside said, of course. It's part of our suffering,
Mhm.
is even projecting that something at some other time in some other way would be the cause and source of our happiness. And it's outrageous to us in a moment of unhappiness to even fathom that our happiness is right here and right now. We feel like it's something that comes and goes. But when we really, what I love about um, Francis is many things, but one of it is his precision and how he really points out that the investigative aspect of the journey. And yeah, when we stop, we begin to investigate. Yeah, and the courage that it takes and the ability to pause can be a process, can be a process just for the nervous system to learn how to become more relaxed. It was a long time ago, intuitively, and every yoga class ends with shavasana. I would say to people, it's not just a treat, you know, it's you're actually practicing something.
Mhm.
You're practicing relaxation. And so we can practice relaxation sitting up, but we can also practice relaxation laying down. And the more you practice it, the better you get at it. Shavasana, we can take it with us, and then it can be with us in a moment where there's a stressful situation that happens because our body has had repeated experiences of being taken to a real quiet,
Mm.
as much, and that's a deepening process. So sometimes when people come to yoga, they feel really uncomfortable because they're like, I can't relax. I'll never relax. It's never going to be for me. So they can't even fathom that it is a journey, and that things can take time. And in the beginning, when you're working on something, it's always a little more challenging when we start. So
Mhm.
it's nice to have the encouragement and the support to get through that beginning phase until things start to invite you. And I would say that's falling in love with your practice. At the beginning, you kind of gotta, okay, I feel like there's something to this. I'm gonna make some time for it. But after a while, it starts to take on its own momentum, and it's something that we want to do because
Mhm.
we love it, you know.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
if we don't love it, that's something also that I love from from Francis's teachings, is not to do it.
Mhm.
That's so radical in our world. We've been so conditioned away from our natural enthusiasm,
Right.
putting aside what's true for us for some idea, that has also spilled over into our spiritual practices,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know. And I use the word practice loosely, but it's
Right.
spilled over into our inquiries, and like we feel like we should. But when we're coming from a should, we're coming from the mind. It's not necessarily the movement of our curiosity and our enthusiasm. So it's best not to reinforce the shoulds, even on the path.
Mhm.
But
Right.
just wait, see what you want, what you truly want, and go from there. These are all things that were really shown to me through Francis. He showed me so much that really was a deconditioning of some of our culture and our ways of approaching things, and needing to. I was such a good student in a sense that I just wanted to learn so much, and
So we've been talking about falling in love, and we've been talking about opening and enthusiasm and getting to know ourselves in these ways. So so much what our experience is as we're beginning or earlier on the journey is that we don't really have a lot of optimism that if we were to really go deeply into knowing who we are, that it would be okay. It feels like there's a lot of pain. A lot of times addiction is driven by that wanting to get away. So how would you, or what would you want to say to somebody who's more in that state of, I've got a lot of trauma, I have a lot of tension in my body, there's fears, and how can I possibly get to that place where I would even be able to settle in and get to know who I am?
not even sure if that conversation would come up at that point, because it would be to say like we have to go in when we're in that mode of. I mean, we all know what it's like to want to push away discomfort and to push away the things that are uh, it's just to really be, to really be. All we can do is share our experience. So we can't come to a situation effectively, really, just by talking.
Mhm.
But if you can find inside yourself and relate to what you're seeing, in the person, and also know inside yourself a deep peace, it transmits itself just
Mhm.
in your own relaxation, in your own knowing. But if you, like, even if somebody would say that to me in during times like that in the past, I would just resist resist it. Words wouldn't do it. Maybe some words would be like little gems,
Mhm.
but really being together, it does a lot. And it all depends on our ability to be here.
Mhm.
And so sometimes, when people try to help, they're uncomfortable. The helper is uncomfortable. So the more comfortable we can be inside of ourselves, it really, it doesn't really even matter what we're saying. If we're trying to be too focused on what they're saying, it might be distracting in a sense. But if we're just breathing and being here, and it it becomes a touch point for that person, the ability to even take small steps of coming away from the things that frighten us, to not deny that person the right to feel that way in that moment. Yes, yeah, I feel like escaping. Okay, understandable. Acceptance and acknowledgement of the moment, the way it is, the way it's showing up, some relaxation becomes available. Not trying to go too much at at the level of mind, because it can get just so tricky. Sometimes we can say the right thing, like not the right thing, but just something that kind of unlocks something that brings some ease in the moment. And who knows what it would be, case by case, moment by moment.
Mhm.
But when we can show up and not be too troubled by life and our own self, it really transmits an ease that's shared, and it gives that possibility to revisit that, because it's an experience. And so I
Mhm.
like to keep it simple. And for me, it's natural to feel loving. So I think that is helpful, as well, just to be in the space, a loving space.
So for someone who's recognizing their own unhappiness and that stuckness and the compulsion in the mind, one of the things that's so beneficial is to be around people who have more calm and peace. On a nervous system level, it co-regulates the nervous
Mm,
system. We downregulate emotionally. We give ourselves that opportunity, like in your classes, to really experience witnessing and being present through movement and through relaxation, and being around someone who's aware as you are that there's nothing wrong and nothing to be fixed on one level is very
mm,
helpful.
mm,
Mhm.
yeah. And it's the deepest level, right? It's
Mhm.
so discounting in modern non-duality when people say, "Oh, no problem," when it's coming from an intellectual place,
Mhm.
you know. And so that's why words are so tricky, and we have to
Mhm.
really be honest with ourselves. But it's true, like just being together can be very helpful. And
Mhm.
talking can be helpful too. It's just, it can be tricky, that's all. So
Mhm.
it's not necessarily the way out, but it can help manage things, or we can see, all we want to really see is how much we're misunderstanding things.
Mhm.
We're I would say that all suffering is coming from a misunderstanding,
Mhm.
which, you know and so we want and when we come to see something, it eases our suffering. So there is a clarification at the intellectual level, but it's more a clarification of a dropping of misunderstandings.
Mhm.
So there's a lot that can be done at the intellectual level that kind of promotes the recognition of our natural enthusiasm and wisdom. Uh, but as you say, when we're working with acute responsiveness in the nervous system, we're just, if anything, if we could help foster friendship with ourselves,
Hmm.
There's a there's an unfriendliness sometimes to our thinking. And you might often have heard, like, would you ever say what you say to yourself to a friend? You wouldn't be friends very long. So sometimes we recognize that, that our thinking is very, aggressive, and we take our thinking personally. So that's one part of it, is to depersonalize the thinking, because you didn't do it. We take it so personally. And another thing I would say that we suffer from is certainty, because behind every juicy thought that's producing some kind of emotion is a I know that this is true. And so sometimes at the intellectual level, it sounds strange, but we're kind of wearing down that sense of certainty. There's a real salve in not knowing. There's a real ease in coming into the honesty of not knowing, to the truth of it. And it's not as scary as we think. So for the mind, it's scary to not know. So once again, it points to a process, but that process doesn't have to be long. For some, it could be a split second. For some, it could be decades. But it's just, there does seem to be an unwinding, clarifying, unlearning, settling, regulating process, depending on our situation.
And when we have the direct experience that when we settle our body after yoga class and we breathe, and then we feel better, our body softens. That was one of the things for me that it took a few years, but my shoulders used to be up here all the time, and then they came down here. And then the only
Yeah.
time they would come back up is if, and I used it very much as a practice of noticing. So when I noticed my shoulders were up, I knew there was something that I was responding to, some kind of fear, or usually it was a thought. And so that process of getting to know ourselves also yields deepening relaxation and
Yeah.
much less shame. A lot of what we're trying to get away from is that feeling of shame and helplessness. How have you worked with that, or what would you say about that?
Once again, like, I think that shame or any kind of suffering is coming from misunderstanding.
Mhm,
So, shame implies, first of all, that we did something
mhm.
and that it wasn't right, and there's something wrong with us or something bad about us, or something that we're doing that's not quite right. But if you really investigate even what you're doing, the only time we evaluate it is a split second after. So all evaluation is in retrospect. But in the very moment, if you really examine the moment and you're willing to give life the innocence that it has, you can see that everything is doing its very best. Everything is doing its best. Everyone is doing their best. Everyone is doing exactly what they need to be doing, given the situation, given the thinking, given the history. It's all happening. It's all just happening. So it's really a story that we tell ourselves in retrospect, that I did that. The end of shame is the recognition of innocence, in a sense, that we are innocent, that and to have the courage to, like, this body mind is not perfect. It bumps into things, it says the wrong things sometimes, and as it's doing it, I'm like, wow, look at that. Look, look at how that happened. But if I feel like I did that and there's something wrong with me because I did that, there's a misunderstanding in that evaluation that happens after the fact. So another part of the falling in love is the recognition of innocence. I think it was Byron Katie that said, very, it was just such a clear thing. She said, if when it comes to, like, terrorism, for example, if I had thoughts like that, I would be doing that. come to us, and we're making the best that we can in every moment with our situation. And so shame, in a sense, is it's a misunderstanding that we're doing after the fact. And we believe that these are the things that are going to drive us to be better in the future. So we don't want to drop it because we think that's the only way to improve. And plus, we've also been conditioned to feel that way. And
Mhm.
even when we don't feel shameful, I just going to do the opposite. When we feel unashamed, our society sometimes actually gets upset with people like that. So it's almost difficult to live from freedom in when the messaging is like, no, you can't be too happy. You have to be upset about certain things, and you should feel ashamed for doing that.
Right.
It's so there's a lot of messaging in our culture. So that's sort of the big idea around shame.
Mhm.
But once again, if it really is in the context of someone that, and we're together and shame is coming up, I, you know, not much needs to be said, because we can say, oh, don't feel that way. But even all of our friends have said that to us,
Mhm.
and we're still feeling that way.
Mhm.
So in those moments, really, for it to go in is to just recognize that sometimes it takes time,
Mhm.
and through the gentleness and the relaxation that's available. I thought it was just a small thing. I thought it was just something that was particular to maybe my way of doing things. But I emphasize gentleness a lot in the classes,
Mhm.
and I've come to see that that is an ever deepening process. And as we become more and more gentle with ourselves, which is not easy in the beginning,
Mhm.
that it's a not going to keep us from continuing to improve in our lives. We already know the truth. We know it's not true.
Right.
So that has a chance to come, and it doesn't have to come by virtue of rearrangement of our thinking, because our thinking is driven by our fundamental understanding. So when we work at the level of thinking, there might be some band-aids that we can do in the meantime, like, no, you're wonderful, But ultimately, the root of our thinking is coming from separation. So, and that is something that is not doesn't come through the mind. That recognition, and it undoes all of the thinking. Our mind all of a sudden serves differently the moment we truly come to rest as
Mhm.
ourself. The thinking changes. So we can work at different levels, to bring some ease to the moment as we deepen in this process of recognition through the infinite tools that life provides. Life is, yoga and meditation are very powerful tools. But a walk in the woods, chat with a good friend. These are all ways of bringing ease and a little bit of peace into our lives. It feels like when we go into therapy or we do these things, it does feel like life has become unmanageable and it feels really big.
Mhm. Right.
And so it's almost outrageous to even consider that small steps, simple steps,
Right.
are very powerful steps to take.
Mhm.
And to just trust. That's another thing, is to trust our journey, to trust ourselves. It's not to trust the mind. When I say trust ourselves,
Mhm.
I'm not saying to trust our mind.
Right.
And that shows already to be able to recognize the difference.
Yeah, because our mind is the part of us that's generating the inner critic thoughts and the deficiency beliefs and all of that. And those aren't true. So to get below the level of thought is so important. And that yoga is wonderful for that.
I'm not so sure that all of the techniques were designed for that, but they've become that. And it's really addressing a need in the West of a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress. So, really wonderful to have these techniques to just, as you say, like regulate the nervous system. And
Mhm.
yeah, and it's just tricky business to work at the level of mind, but there's room for it, but it's not the
Mhm.
only way,
Right. Yeah.
because we have all the answers. Really, it's just to stop believing the mind. It's a very it's outrageous sometimes to even suggest that we don't actually need our mind as much as we think we do, and there's a real resistance to that. I like to point things out sometimes, like the commentator in the mind, the narrator, is sort of like the sports announcer. Like if you turn the volume off, you still see all the action. And
Yeah.
it takes a lot of repetition to hear, no, you actually don't. There is a wisdom in us that knows what to do, and it knows the way, it
Mm.
knows what you need. And we begin to trust that more when we find it.
Right.
The mind might be a little louder at first, but we learn to just say, I'm not upset with you. You don't have to go away, but I'm just not listening anymore.
Mhm.
It's just
Right.
not true. We just don't have that belief in everything that we're saying.
Yes. Yeah.
That's a huge relief when we don't have to believe the content of our thoughts, when we recognize that they're conflictual and they're not telling the truth. It's not an accurate description of ourselves. It's not an accurate description of what happened, even the past. Like we
Mm.
say that happened, but really being open to not knowing, it can be a real opening.
Mhm.
But that happened and it's going to happen again. There's a certainty, even
Yeah.
in our own memories, that
Mhm.
keeps the whole ball rolling.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I don't even know. Like, I don't even know what I am. Like, that's profound not knowing.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of that opens up when we allow ourselves to not know. It frees us from a lot of suffering.
Mhm.
Like,
And
oh,
it
that's
frees
going to
ourselves.
be a hard day. It's like, well, I don't know. See, already there's freedom there.
Yeah.
You can feel it instantly in the not knowing.
Mhm.
One little drop of freedom at a time, we're just,
Right.
it accumulates.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we look back and we're like, wow, life is a little different than it used to be. And
We're a
I'll take
lot
it.
different. Yeah.
Yeah.
Our body's different, our energy, the thoughts in the mind, everything shifted. Yeah.
Mm. Something fell away, and then who we truly are, our magnificence gets a chance to shine, and then we get to fully live this life. What's our purpose? We don't have to be too intellectual about that.
Mhm. Right.
you know Everything in us wants to love and to freedom and peace. These are the things that we naturally love.
Mhm. Well,
And
that
what
seems like a good place to finish.
Yeah.
We're back to falling in love,
Yeah.
and, it's being woven all the way through.
Mm.
So how can people get a hold of you? Let's do the practical stuff. Your website, you live in Nova Scotia, Canada, so people wanna come to your in-person classes if you're here, but for people who aren't living here, you have some online classes too, so why don't you talk about that a bit?
At first, I'd love to encourage anybody who's interested in the deep teachings of yoga to visit Francis,
Mhm.
because that's an incredible resource that we all have in today's world. And so, definitely, if you want to visit Francis Lucille, I would highly recommend that. If you're drawn to connecting with me, that's also a joy. And I do online work internationally, so I do one-to-one or group classes online as well. And I do long programs here in Nova Scotia for teacher training, for yoga teacher training, which is really wonderful to be able to, because as soon as we decide we want to share this, boy, we start to learn, you know. So I love
Yeah.
the programs. If you want to visit my website, you can visit yogaheart.ca, and you'll find out more about the programs there. And yeah, if you want to reach out, I certainly love to connect and share the goodness.
Yeah, so people Google him, then they could see a bunch of different things of his and watch some things and yeah, interviews, different teachings.
Yeah, yeah, you get a lot of the dialogue. Some people feel like those that are drawn to really thinking it through seem to be drawn to Francis because he has a very scientific approach, a lot of precision. Um, but everything that he's speaking to is is an experience. So even if we're talking about it, it's an experience. But what you don't get through the internet is being with him and
Mhm.
the meditation and the yoga. So that's nice when we can actually get together.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
also lovely. Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
We do the online yoga with me, so I do offer the things that I've learned and through Francis through the online yoga that I'm offering, and it's more the yoga of discovery. I mean, it's less about trying to get the body to a certain state or the mind to a certain state. So I do offer different initiatives in the yoga,
Mhm.
but a big part of what I'm interested in is to really find ways to really discover who we are through self-recognition
Right.
and through the tradition of Advaita Vedanta and um, Kashmiri Shaivism and through the incredible teachings of Jean Klein and all the teachers that were touched by his understanding of Kashmiri Shaivism
Mhm.
fascinates me to no end the joy of that yoga. So that's a big part of what I'm doing here is
Mhm.
just sharing my joy and my experience with this yoga,
Mhm.
as well as meeting the situation where we're at, depending on who comes and what they're interested in. We find our way.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And thank you for getting together and doing this interview and being part of the Radical Recovery Summit as well. I think it's wonderful to have a broad range of voices, and it's inspiring for people who are not yet as in touch with themselves to know that this is possible and that there are ways to do it and to deepen into our connection with ourselves.
Yeah, I so agree that because it feels impossible sometimes when we're really
Hmm.
and sometimes we think it's going to take a long time,
Hmm.
but it's right here.
It is.
It's nice to know, and it doesn't have to be as hard as we think. We can invite in a path of ease.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
Hmm.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. It's nice to hear that, even if it doesn't feel that way sometimes. To hear that it's here
Hmm.
for you.
It is.
We don't have to settle for this. We can we can get together and find love and find peace inside.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
there are ways.
Well, thank
Thank
you.
you. Yeah, so grateful for you. Really wish you a great summit with some great speakers doing some amazing things in the world. So thank you for what you're doing.
Oh, thank you. Hmm.
Mm.
Hello, this is Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center Radical Recovery Summit. We are so excited to bring you the lineup for January 10th to 19th, 2020. Go to radicalrecoverysummit.com to see the new headliners for 2020 and to sign up. You can watch free January 10th to 19th or buy an all-access pass.